Welcome to the Scalar Learning Podcast, your central hub for all things related to education. Join us every episode for the most up-to-date tips and strategies on how to maximize student potential. Sit back, listen, and enjoy.
Scalar learning, give me that scalar learning. Scalar learning, give me that scalar learning.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Scalar Learning Podcast, where we talk about education all the time. And today is another special episode where we are doing a career spotlight on a very good friend of mine who's joining the show, very impressive individual, and he is a data scientist. And you're going to hear all about what that means to be a data scientist. So his name is Michael. I'm going to give him a little bit of background, and then we're going to dive into everything that he does and what he studied in school and all that good stuff. But Michael has been basically processing what he calls in his industry analytics, basically a lot of number crunching and essentially analysis of numbers and statistics to a high level to make predictions about different types of behaviors or different types of outcomes, etc. So I'm talking about it very generally. We're going to dive in with Michael right now. So without further ado, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited. So me and Mike go way back. Well, we go back about a few years, I'd say. But Mike, why don't you tell everybody tell us where'd you go to school, what'd you study, all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So did my undergrad at Harvard, studied economics. Specifically, I was really interested in health econ. And health economics is kind of the study of how people behave in terms of their behavior and their expenditures on healthcare when there are a lot of weird incentives in the healthcare industry. And so, studying insurance markets and, markets for healthcare and how those don't really look like markets for, whatever it is, pencils, pens, widgets, whatever it is you're actually buying, because we have weird incentives. So finished my econ degree, decided I want to do even more, kind of get into more depth, and ended up getting a PhD in economics. And again, focusing specifically on health economics. And so I got my PhD from UPenn. That was about 5 years and change. And since that time, have joined, I decided I was kind of done with academia. I joined the private sector. I've joined now a couple different startup companies, helping them to use the data that they currently collect to make better decisions actually about the workforce. And just, brief segue, I'd studied organizational behavior within healthcare organizations, got really interested in it, and started trying to understand what makes people tick. Why do they work well together? Why do they work poorly? What's the impact of a good or a bad boss? And so there's tons of human capital data out there that organizations collect but don't really do much with. And so I kind of like to fill that gap and helping them leverage the power of that data to make better decisions about their people so that they can get them to reach their potential, get more out of their employees.
So you basically, it's not just the hiring part, or maybe that's not even a very small part, but it's about now, once we have a collection of employees, how do we allocate those resources and how do we line people up with particular positions? Is that right?
Yeah, it's all stages of what I call the employee lifecycle. If you think about the decisions that you're making about your talent, the most obvious decision is who to hire, right? But you're making decisions constantly about how to onboard and train them, who should supervise them, what their compensation level should be, when they should be up for promotions, what teams they should belong to. Even I'm studying now where they sit and who they sit next to and how that influences their performance. So, there's a long list of research that basically finds that people make imperfect decisions because we're biased by our own experiences and because we don't have all the information. So I try to supplement those decisions with data so that people are more likely to make the right decisions throughout that employee life cycle. And if you do that, you get more out of your employees.
Now, I just got to ask as a general matter, because this is fascinating. Of course, me and Mike are good friends, and we've talked in general details about what you do in the companies you work for. But a question just popped into my head. I don't think I've asked you this before, but when you're, let's say, advising a company, with regards to salaries for certain employees, it usually feels like it's the way it starts is a company is just trying to pay the least amount of money to an employee. But I just got to ask, is that always the case, or is that always the way that you advise? Because I have to imagine in a lot of cases, maybe even the majority of cases, you might go the other way and say, no, if you really want to make this a lasting relationship, a fruitful partnership, so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point. And in many cases, companies are trying to kind of maximize the employee that they get for the minimum salary. But what we're finding in the research is that, first off, you get kind of more effort and more engagement from employees when you pay them wages that are, near the mean or even above the mean in terms of, kind of how they compare to industry standards. And companies are realizing that if you pay employees less than you could, it might work for a short while, but people look around, they have options, especially in an era of social media where it's easy to find jobs, and they tend to leave more quickly. And guess what? When the employee leaves, replacing that person, finding a replacement, training them, getting them up to speed can cost as much as 1.5 of their annual salary. So, 150% to try to retrain someone and fill that gap. So that's a great point. And some of the advice that I often give companies is, just because you can get away in the short term with paying them less than they might deserve, in the long term, it actually tends not to work out as well.
It's so interesting because I think it just highlights a principle that I honestly do try and follow myself. And I think what you're really getting at is in these types of cases in hiring scenarios, if you end up just doing things along the lines of, you could say roughly morality or equality, I should say. It's like you do what is fair and you give somebody what they probably should deserve based on market, or even better if you think their skills warrant a higher salary, things will work out better. It's kind of a nice lesson, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the analogy I use, and I borrow this from my kind of healthcare background, is, people tend to underinvest in preventative care. So giving a person the right salary and wages along the way is kind of preventative care. You keep them happy, and in the end, they'll stay longer. All of a sudden, if you have a heart attack, then you have to pay a ton more than you would have if you just done regular checkups. So I tell people, listen, think about the long term. Like, you're exactly right, Josefa. If you pay people along the way what they deserve and you kind of treat them with respect, you end up paying less in the long term because you've kind of engendered that loyalty, and that's really key.
That's really cool. So I want to get into the math very shortly, but just for anybody listening, because I, of course, find this fascinating. If they're kids or children or students listening, in addition to parents, and they're saying, I don't know what it is about what this guy's saying, but it sounds kind of fascinating. What would you say what were you interested in college and beyond that made this career such a good fit for you? And how would what types of kids or what types of thinkers would you say would fall nicely into this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are actually two paths to being a data scientist. One is kind of the engineering path. So there are a lot of data scientists that are former engineers that like working with code and like thinking very logically, and they apply these mathematical models to their data instead of just writing kind of pure code. I came at it from a different angle, which is more of a social scientist. And for me, the thing that makes someone a social scientist is asking interesting questions and then digging really hard to solve them. And so, if you have that intellectual curiosity where you wonder, what it is that keeps someone on the job longer, or what motivates someone to seek out, preventative care versus, kind of care when they're having an acute, whatever it is, condition, then those are interesting questions. And the first step along those lines is, I study stats. I think econ is kind of a derivative of statistics, but then ultimately work with faculty or professors or teachers and try engaging in research. Ask a cool question, find some data to answer it, figure out what the answer is. It can be any number of different fields, but if you like that process of asking questions and then answering them using data, then you can just find so many opportunities to keep doing that. And that's what builds up those data science chops.
This really, what you're saying reminds me of, and I apologize if people say this to you all the time, but this reminds me of the book Freakonomics, which I love that book. Is this kind of what you're getting at, where you ask these interesting questions and actually try and answer them?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And by the way, a huge fan of the books, the podcast. I was actually interviewed for the podcast about a year and a half ago. So I love their approach, which is they find kind of common questions, but then they find really creative ways of answering those questions. And if those books or even the Malcolm Gladwell type of work, if that really resonates with you and you love reading that stuff, then I think, a career as an economist or a social scientist is definitely a good path to consider.
It's such a great book. If you guys haven't read it, I haven't listened to the podcast, but the book is really phenomenal and really fun. Okay, so this is all great stuff. I know, Mike, you've been on different shows and different podcasts. You've got quite the reputation in the data scientist world. So it's great to have you. It's great to have you. I don't know if I'm using the right vernacular for that, but it's great to have you on here. So now let's get down to the nitty gritty. We have students, we have parents out there listening about math and how does it actually relate to the real world. I get that question a lot. Why do I need to know this? What's the relevance of it? You're going to give it to us in your line of work, and it's going to be really, really interesting, I hope. So now let's get into it. So what are some of the math concepts that you use on a regular basis to do what you do?
Yeah, honestly, math underlies everything I do. So there are, so many different examples. I'm using math constantly. I think first and foremost, if you're thinking about running statistical models, regression, a logistic regression, any of that stuff, that's all linear algebra. I didn't even realize this initially. I just had an aptitude for working with data. And oftentimes the first way you're exposed to that data is in an Excel spreadsheet. I didn't realize that the data is all matrices, right? It's literally doing transformations of matrices in order to arrive at some result, some conclusion. So, it was funny that I was studying math independently of working with data and just playing around with it, and then realized, holy crap, this is all linear algebra. This is exactly the stuff that I learned in terms of transposing matrices and so on and so forth. So, first and foremost, if you have an interest in social science and statistics and econ, I think paying very close attention to those linear algebra classes, those are tremendously valuable. Go ahead.
For guys that are listening, if you're not familiar, if you haven't gone to this stage yet in math, I'll just define a matrix in very broad terms. And by the way, I had Howard Marks on not too long ago talking about video games. And again, that's another concept. We talk about matrices with respect to storage of data. Even me as a software engineer, coder, we use matrices there too. So a matrix is simply this. It is a collection of data or numbers organized in rows and columns, more or less, kind of like a spreadsheet that you might see in Microsoft Excel, something like that. Matrices are very near and dear to me in particular because that's kind of what my logo for Scalar Learning. It's all built around a matrix. You have the brackets on the outside that contain the data, and then you have the data inside, and that, of course, is the inner part of my logo. So it's so cool. Yes, awesome. Matrices. Yeah. Check them out.
Absolutely. So that's for 100% first and foremost. I think beyond that, there's, very simple concepts in statistics like, mean, median. You're doing work with standard deviations, and I deal in variances all the time. And I'm constantly trying to find ways to display that information about a big column of data. So then we're calculating correlations and covariances and things like that. Those are, at the end of the day, those are all very simple arithmetic calculations that are being applied to a column of numbers. But at the end of the day, it's a Greek formula, right? There's Greek lettering to represent mean and variance and standard deviation, correlation, covariance, all of those things.
Now, I had a friend of mine who owns a construction company on yesterday, and he talked about the importance of mental math in his line of work in particular. It may not always be the case, but he has to make on a regular basis calculations mentally on the fly. Would you say, is it the same in your industry, or is it not so important or critical?
It absolutely is, primarily because I'm doing gut checks all the time. So a big part of being a data scientist is making sure that you're cleaning, you're extracting and cleaning the data in the right way. And to do that, you need to constantly kind of compare different numbers, different columns of numbers, and figure out, hey, is this number that I arrived at, this average across the population, does that seem to be within range given all the other figures that I'm looking at? And so, yeah, you're absolutely using these kind of rules of thumb and just eyeballing data and trying to figure out, okay, did I do something wrong? Or does it seem like if you add up these different columns of numbers and multiply them by 2, you end up with the answer that I just generated?
So good. And this is literally what I talk about all the time with mental math. This is the same on standardized test preparation for construction, for being a data scientist. It's all about being able to recognize whether or not something makes sense. And why do you need that? Because when you are doing these calculations via a computer or a calculator, you could make a mistake. You could type something in wrong, or you could enter a piece of code incorrectly. And if your number sense isn't on point, you're not going to see the error. You're going to just assume and take the computer or the machine's word for it. And that is the key. Like I said, so this is some real relevance with respect to mental math. So for all the kids out there listening and hearing this, take it to heart. And really the beautiful thing about it, the final thing that I'll say on mental math right now anyways, the final thing that I'll say is that it's really not that hard to improve your mental math skills. It would just take maybe a month, maybe not even, of good dedicated daily practice in short bursts to shore up your multiplication and division. Okay, Mike, back to you. Talk more about math in your world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, beyond the kind of statistical operations that I mentioned before, a lot of times I'm trying to do some optimization, right? So I'll have a system. Actually, I'll give you an example from just a couple weeks ago. I needed to figure out, I don't want to get into too much of the weeds here, but there's a company that sort of labels employees red, yellow, green. The idea is that the reds are more at risk of leaving. They have a higher flight risk. I needed to figure out, given certain assumptions, given a different distribution of greens, yellows, and reds, kind of what was the average tenure of the population, right? And really, at the end of the day, I realized what I had on my hands were 3 variables, which was the proportion of that population, that employee population that was green, yellow, red. And then I also had 3 different equations because I knew the relative distribution of them, and I knew kind of on average how long employees stayed. So it's funny that I kind of looked at this and I realized, oh, wow, I have 3 equations and I have 3 variables. I remember this is SAT math. I can solve for one of them given that I have the other 2. And so I plugged in the numbers. I ended up with the right answer. I double checked it, and then I entered it into my Excel spreadsheet. This is something that, there's no math program that really would have been able to do it. Like I just needed to sort of reason it out myself. And literally I tried for about half an hour to figure it out in my head, and then I wrote it down on a piece of paper, my 3 equations. I literally felt like I was taking the SAT. So it's funny, Josefa, you came to mind because I realized, holy crap, I'm 35 years old and I've been doing this for a long time, and yet I still can't escape those SAT questions that, I had to deal with back in the day when I was studying for the SAT math.
The College Board just revamped the entire SAT in March. They just released a new one, so it's got a whole new spin to it now from how it was when we took it.
Really?
Yep. Back to 1,600 points, but I actually just did an episode on the new SAT a couple episodes ago, so if you guys want to check it out, you can, where I talk about the changes, and more importantly, I actually gathered some analytics and ran the numbers on a bunch of practice tests that I had access to, and was able to figure out exactly how the questions had been redistributed based on different topics. So it was really interesting because there have been some substantial redistribution of question types.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I studied for the SATs, 20 years ago now, but I don't know. It's been so long, and it's such a skill in and of itself, right? It's not just knowing math, it's knowing the types of questions that they ask. And so I'm not sure how I would do on the SAT, and part of me is tempted to try to take one just to see.
I can arrange that.
I'm sure you can.
I still take them all the time. Okay, so cool. And I know you mentioned at some point that you actually, this is something that's really cool because I know a lot of kids don't like logarithms. They don't like natural log. They don't like whatever. They have just a natural aversion towards logs. Tell us, but they're important and they're useful. Tell us how you use logs in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I use logs every day. And it's because taking the log of a number is a good way of what's called scaling or standardizing that number. And I'll give you an example. If I'm trying to predict how long is someone's going to stay on the job, well, the number of days is helpful, but from one profession to another, the average tenure could be a year or two more, a year or two less. It's hard to compare those things. And so if I'm trying to compare the effects across different job categories, it's really hard to do because a day can mean something very different for an engineer than it means for someone who's, working in an hourly job. So what I end up doing more often than not is I'll take that variable and I'll take the log of it, and then I'll enter it into whatever model I'm running. Again, a regression model or a logistic model. And the nice thing is that, by the power of math, that automatically scales the variable. So now when I'm interpreting the effect of some variable on tenure, say distance to work, right? Now I'm not interpreting, hey, what's the impact of living close to your work on the days that you work on the job? I end up being able to interpret it in terms of the percent of tenure. So how much longer you're 10% light, you're going to stay 10% longer because you ended up working close to work, or you lived close to work or whatever. So that's a really key attribute, and it's one of those really amazing things that all of a sudden these numbers that could be very different, now they become very sort of standardized, and there's a common scale that we can use, and we can interpret them in terms of percents, which also, by the way, means that I can present results to a CEO, and it's just more interpretable, it's more digestible. So we were chatting earlier, like I love logs. I'm doing logarithmic transformations all the time, because it's just like best practice in economics is if you're throwing something into an equation, you should take the log of it, because it's just going to behave kind of more in a better way.
Very interesting. So you mentioned briefly percentages, and I know we've been talking about some higher level concepts like matrices, logs, but what about some of the more basic things? For example, I'm teaching a 4th grade class every day in math, and we're learning things like fractions, percents, decimals. I have to imagine those are a big part of everything you do as well.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Again, percentages I think are super important, because you need to understand, like I said, the absolute value of things can change and it can be different, but percentages can be consistent across different units of measurement. So, it's more intuitive for me to say a 10% increase in the distance to work results in a 5% decrease in your attrition. So, ultimately, almost everything I'm doing, I'm trying to take it as a percent, because it's more easy to understand, and it's easier to sort of explain to people that I work with around, what the interpretation is. And again, it's funny. A percent seems like the easiest thing in the world, but it's core to everything that I'm doing is being able to sort of calculate, and of course, do those calculations in my head on the fly, figuring out, okay, what's, 30 is what percent of 800. It's just, you need to do those exercises so that you can just spout it off really quick.
One day we should have a mental math competition. I think it'd be very interesting, because I practice a lot, obviously, just by virtue of what I do, and I'm sure you do too, just naturally. So it would be kind of fun. Not now. Yeah. Not going to do it on the air, but we'll do it, I think, in private, because I don't want to lose publicly. We'll plan that another time. Okay, so cool. Excellent. So we talked about all these different applications. Is there anything else, any other big areas of math that you use on a regular basis?
I mean, those are the big ones. I think, it's funny when there are other models, the models that economists tend to use are heavy on linear algebra. There are other models that are used more by your kind of engineer type data scientists that are using things like geometric distances. And it's funny that we're doing this for the podcast, because they're using scalars to measure distances between, two different locations and things like that. I'm trying to think the support vector models use a lot of those. So, those, that's funny. It's, as a data scientist, you run these models and you don't think about what's under the hood, because you don't really have to know. It just spits out results, and the results either work or they don't. But, I always like to tell people, back in grad school when I was learning about all these models and how they worked, it's super important to dig into the details to understand exactly what's going on under the hood, because there are assumptions being made by those models, and you want to make sure that you're not violating those assumptions. Something like a normal distribution, really straightforward. It's easy to calculate if something is normally distributed, but if your data isn't, that has huge implications for how you can interpret the results. So, it's under the hood. There's so much math going on. These models are all math. And it's, I get out of practice and it's been a while since I've dug into the textbooks and figured out what they're doing, but it's absolutely important to to understand that.
I got one last question for you, and I'm going to give you a second to even think about it. But if you could reflect back and tell me, based on statistics or data or analysis that you've run, what is one thing or something that you've discovered that was really interesting, that was extremely counterintuitive, that you learned, and maybe there's tons of things that you've learned probably, but that you learned you were like, wow, this really blew me away with respect to employment and relationships at work? Yeah.
The one I'll cite is actually one that's been cited a bit. They talked about it on the Freakonomics podcast. Adam Grant wrote about it. We started studying. I got very interested in predicting how long people would stay on the job, how they perform. That's something I've done for a long time. But you can ask them questions, and often they try to game the system. So I got very interested in, can I measure things about you without you giving me those answers that might give me a clue as to how good an employee you would be? And some of the things we were capturing at my last job were these latent signals. Like in our case, we knew, where you had, what IP address you used to log into our assessment, but also what browser you used. So, my being kind of interested in asking interesting questions, we threw your browser choice into our models, and we found that your choice of browser was actually a very strong predictor of performance in these jobs. And I'll put you on the spot, Josefa. What browser do you use?
Google Chrome.
So good news for you. Google Chrome and Firefox users stay on the job 5 to 10% longer. They perform a couple percentage points better than their Safari and or Internet Explorer using colleagues. And, that was fascinating to me that we could get that signal just once you log into the platform. But B, we dug in a little bit more and we found out it wasn't about technical aptitude, or it wasn't about your typing scores or anything else. It was just a matter of the fact that you took the initiative to install a non-default browser on your computer, Josefa, shows that you're someone that cares about your productivity, that you're taking initiative, that you actually want to be as productive as possible. So, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, because a lot of people look at me and say, okay, I know that Internet Explorer users aren't the best, but I thought it was really interesting that you can learn something about someone without asking them a single question.
I would have to say that's super interesting. And I mean, maybe counterintuitive is not the right word, but man, it's mind blowing to me that you would have that type of a correlation with something like that. Because I mean, the only reason why I wouldn't call it counterintuitive, it's not like I would think the opposite or something will be true, but I would think it obviously would have no effect. And that's really interesting. But the way you explained it makes sense.
Yeah. So that I live for those sort of findings where we dig into some data and we find something you wouldn't have even known without having the data and asking the right question and then putting it together. And when we share that stuff, and then of course when it gets picked up by the press and lots of people write about it, I mean, that's just gravy for me. That's the best feeling in the world.
All right. So cool. Thank you so much for joining us. So we are now at the end of the show. Mike, if anybody wants to reach out and check out your website or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have my personal website, michaelhousman.com. Last name is Housman, no E in there. So feel free to visit the website. It's where I post any of my most recent articles, stuff that's written about me. And then, of course, my email address is listed on the site as well. So if you want to get in touch, shoot me a line. I love hearing from people who are reading the stuff that I'm writing.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. And again, if you want more information or that link to that website, go to www.scalarlearning.com. You can check out all the show notes there. And remember, episodes are dropping on the regular this summer, every day, summer of 2016. So check back regularly. And of course, as always, thank you for tuning in. And I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.
Scalar learning. Give me that Scalar learning. Scalar learning. Give me that Scalar learning.